Designing a small garden can be tricky sometimes, but in this video I'm going to give you some tricks and techniques that I use to maximise space and sometimes make the garden feel bigger than it actually is. Working here in Nottingham in the UK, I get invited out to quite a lot of small gardens, often terraced or courtyard spaces, where space is an absolute premium. And since the pandemic, we've realised just how important our outdoor space is, right? Yeah, I'm often greeted by a client who has a long wish list of elements that they want to fit into their garden, yet can't stop the space feeling like that cupboard under the stairs. Small gardens are actually my favourite kind of design challenge, and today I'm going to be showing you 3 gardens that I've designed where I've used some specific tricks and techniques in order to maximise the space and to stop the gardens feeling smaller than they actually are. So as with all gardens, the site analysis or site survey is absolutely crucial. If you haven't done this yet, or if you're having a few troubles, by all means you can check out the video, link above there on surveying gardens. That might help you a little bit. And clearly the smaller the space, the more critical each measurement within that survey really often is. Now we also need to know exactly what the client wants within the garden, and as I said before, sometimes they can create a really long list which we need to refine and get down to just some key elements. We also have to be a little bit realistic here, and if they're talking about a play park, swings, slides, a quiet place to sit, perhaps a large lawn, these sorts of things within a small space, we might have to suggest a few compromises. And again, trying to get this down to a bullet point list is really important. Now, once we've got those 2 elements sorted out, we need to start considering layout. And often I start by creating zones within the garden. And one garden that illustrates this concept really well was a terrace garden here in West Bridgford that I was called out to. As you'll see from the photos, the clients had tried to make the most of this garden, but it had become tired and they didn't have the time or the inclination to mow the lawn. The boundaries were falling apart or overgrown. The deck was starting to fall apart, and the levels meant that the lower half of the garden felt detached and not particularly inviting. And so we discussed the brief with the client. They wanted a space to eat and entertain, somewhere for the hot tub that they already had, somewhere that they could catch a movie in an evening. They also wanted areas of the garden that didn't feel too overlooked by the neighbours, and finally they really wanted a garden that would entice you to go out into it. The couple that I was working with also mentioned that they work quite a lot during the week, and so that key phrase low maintenance came up within when we were looking at the brief. This is a concept that I've come across quite a lot, and I'm going to be doing a video next week all about low maintenance garden design. So if you're interested in that, don't forget to subscribe, just so that you don't miss that. Now in a larger garden, this brief probably wouldn't be that tricky, but within a small space like this, I had to be very careful to make sure that I got all those key elements within the garden. And there was quite a lot to get in. Yeah, as you can see from this simplified version of the survey, the main part of the garden was just 7 metres wide and 10 metres long for the most of it. Now I know some of you might be thinking, Neil, that's not a small garden, but you know what? It's all about perspective. Clearly if you've got a small balcony or a terrace, that could be a quarter of the size. But bear with me, because the concept we're talking about here works no matter what the size of the garden, but is really helpful when it comes to the smaller gardens. So with this space, I started dividing the garden into 3 zones. And what I mean by zones is areas for specific needs or requirements, such as a dining area, for example. Now I chose 3 initially because most zones need a minimum of about 3 or 4 metres in depth. And I knew that I'd have to have some steps and some planting in there as well. But when thinking about the number of zones you're going to split a garden into, it's often a case of trial and error. Thinking about what elements could go where, I thought the hot tub would want to go fairly close to the house for a bit more privacy. If you're going to watch a film, you want it to be further away from the house, so you're really outside. And then entertaining and eating would want to be outside of the shadow of the house. But then I thought on reflection that actually I didn't want the hot tub right next to the house, as it would become such a focal point. So I moved this to the second segment and then decided to have a bit more living space outside of the doors. But then when I looked at the levels again, I realised that we needed to add a step in the first area due to the change of the door sill heights. And really the areas nearest the house is a little bit small for eating and entertaining, and the hot tub area was the biggest section. So I took the layout and I split the middle section so it's just big enough to take the hot tub, which was around 3 metres, and then have a second larger eating and entertaining space. And this is where we got to. And I find this concept of zoning right at the early stages of garden design really useful when we need to make sure that we're fitting in all those elements within the brief within a small space. Now, clearly the client is paying our bills, so we can't just go and design a garden that we think looks really good and forget about some of those elements because they just don't squeeze into that space. But once I'd got those all in and I got the zone sorted, I then started to think about how people move around the space, thinking about the balancing between soft and hard landscaping, making sure I've got lots of planting in there. Clearly with this garden I had to consider the levels a little bit, where the damp-proof course was, where the finished element of the garden was, and how we were going to transition that. And after a bit of back and forth with the client, a few tweaks to the design, this is where we got to.
So I didn't want a lawn, as it's just too small a space to have a real lawn without it becoming overly compacted. So I used a larger areas of planting and some gravel to break up the harder landscaping and ensure a level of permeability through the space. Here in the UK we get quite a bit of rain, so need to make sure that's got somewhere to go. I also added a tree in the larger bed, a flowering pear, and then there was a small camellia that had some sentimental value to the client, and this was already in the garden, so we just dug that up and moved it to this other bed to give some structural planting and thus balance to the other side. There were 2 pergolas that ran the width of the garden. These were partly to hold elements such as the cinema screen and a canvas shade sail that the client wanted for shade, as well as some lighting, but also they helped to draw the eye in away from the house and the surrounding gardens. We planted a number of climbers which over time will soften the whole feel of the garden, and I'll no doubt be back with some updated photos next summer as the garden fills out a bit.
And I think trees are really key within garden design, and especially within a small garden. It can seem a little bit counterintuitive, can't it, putting a great big tree within quite a small space, but it can often work in the opposite way. And clearly I'm talking about small garden trees here, but it's not just trees that this idea works with. It can also be small structures, arches, trellis screens, maybe a pergola. What we're trying to do is we're trying to distract the eye away from the boundaries around the garden, which often draw the garden in. And another designer favourite trick when it comes to a small, especially rectangular or square garden, is designing on an angle, perhaps 45 degrees from the viewpoint, or perhaps creating some curves in the same sort of angles, trying to stop this channeling or this blinkering of the view down into the garden. If we go off at a slightly different angle, that can work wonders. The next garden I'm going to show you illustrates this idea, or these 2 ideas, quite well. The concept of using structure within the garden, but also designing on an angle. And this garden was built on quite a tight budget, so it shows you that you don't just need to throw money at a problem.
I was invited to take a look at this garden a couple of years ago, and as you can hopefully see, it really was quite narrow, just 6 metres from the house to the rear fence. And this was amplified by the fact that the fence at the back was quite tall, and everything just felt a little oppressive. This, combined with the balance of the patio to the lawn and how they were half and half almost, made the boundary feel closer than it actually was.
So as we talked through the brief, we very quickly realised that we were going to scrap the idea of a lawn. It wasn't quite big enough. The client first off started talking about a pond and how much they liked that idea. But again, when we talked through the practicalities, the idea of maintaining a pond really put her off. She was open to the idea of taller structures, and when we looked at where the sun was within the garden, we thought it'd be quite nice to split and have 2 seating areas rather than just one. This gave the option of sitting in the sun or in the shade, depending on the type of day. And for me, I really like the idea of 2 seating areas as it helps bring paved areas into proportion with the general size of the garden. She liked the idea of a Japanese themed garden, which worked well. I talked a little bit about perhaps creating some boardwalks, but some people, they're not keen on the idea of decking, so I had to be a little bit more creative on that idea. So once I got the brief sorted out, I then started sketching, very quickly realised that because the garden was quite shallow, I wanted to try and detract from that rear boundary. And as I say, we're thinking about trees and structures, but also thought very quickly that I wanted to integrate some 45 degree angles, or at least some quirky angles, so as to stop this idea of it being very short. And because the client had talked a little bit about like the idea of liking the Japanese style, I went back to the idea of water and a pond, and then there's a concept called a dry pond, which essentially is a bit of a dip, and then using plants and boulders we can create a space that looks a bit like a pond, but doesn't necessarily have to hold water, and thus the maintenance of filtration didn't have to be included within that. I also still was quite keen on the idea of a boardwalk, but again, if we're not going to use decking, I thought we're just going to have to revert back to paving, but create that same concept or that same visual idea that the Japanese use so often with their timber boardwalks through a garden. And this is what I came up with.
Note the multi-stem tree. This would start to break up the view and the height of the rear fence as it matures, and the archways would also draw the eye within the garden rather than straight to the fence, especially when the climbing plants start to scramble all over them. I then used this boardwalk, but from porcelain planks rather than decking, that leads from one seating area by the house to a sunny spot in the corner, and to take away from the rectangular feel of the garden and confuse that sense of proportion. I also opted for a circle as a second seating area to help with the balance within the planting area of the garden, although if I'm honest, our guys weren't overly impressed with me, as they then had to spend several hours cutting a perfect circle. Again, I need to get some more images now. The planting will have filled out a bit, but hopefully you can see the layout and the concept of this working at angles from the house. The mixed paving was intended again to draw your eye into the garden and emphasise these angles, so you didn't just get hit by that big fence full stop to the rear of the space.
Now, I'm very aware that within this video it feels like we're just taking small gardens as a bit of an obstacle to overcome, but actually I do want to change tack a little bit and suggest that with a small garden there's a bit of an opportunity here as well. I think small gardens can often feel a little bit more intimate, potentially cosy, and also to really do a garden justice you need a good budget. With a large garden, it often needs a large budget, and although that doesn't necessarily translate as a small garden can work on a small budget, what it does mean is you can potentially make the budget stretch that little bit further with a small garden, when in a medium sized garden we might have to make quite a few compromises.
And finally, as designers, we can really earn our fees when we come up with clever solutions and good use of space. Now, this might be an area that has more than one use. This garden I designed a couple of years ago incorporated a deck that opened up to reveal a jacuzzi so as to allow more room for the lawn for the kids to play on, yet a space for the adults to have a glass of wine on without sitting around the jacuzzi constantly. It was a tricky detail to design, but the result worked well, and it allowed two different elements to be in exactly the same zone.
Now, this final garden I'm going to talk you through is very typical of a space where clients had an extension to their house. The space that they've been left with has shrunk considerably, as has their budget, which is not an uncommon occurrence when it comes to a designer coming in after a building extension.
As you can hopefully see, the extension really stuck out into the garden, creating a bit of a narrow space to the side and then just 7 metres between the house boundary and the rear boundary. There was also a level change that would mean that we'd need some sort of steps down into the garden. Because the bifold doors opened along this side elevation, it meant that we'd need the change of level to be at the end of the house, leaving a smaller, lower area.
So as usual, as part of the brief, I asked the clients to come back with a bit of a wish list as to what they wanted to include within the garden. And this is what they came back with.
Somewhere to eat out, as well as somewhere to relax within the garden. A lawn for the grandchildren to play on. Somewhere to store some kayaks. As well as increased privacy from the neighbour, they also wanted a bit of a water feature. So a lot to fit into a small garden as always, and the storage of kayaks was a new one for me, especially when they were 3 metres long. So I started zoning the garden as I showed you before, creating a terrace with steps down, thinking about the levels. And as it happened, because we needed to have a raised terrace area to step out onto, it meant we could incorporate some storage underneath the deck for those kayaks.
Now, a water feature on a tight budget can sometimes be a bit of a tricky scenario, but after carefully talking this through with the client, they found like a water globe that they particularly liked online, and so we went off and found one that was going to be big enough that you could see from inside the house as well as from the deck, but without actually having it on the deck, so putting it in that lower space within the garden. And again, there was a little bit of back and forth with the concept, a bit of moving things around, changing things around, justifying things to the client. And this is where I got to.
So as far as privacy goes, we also added some Philostachys nigra, clump-forming bamboo. Because they were placed right next to the deck in the raised bed, we could specify these without the fear they'd start running and popping up in other parts of the garden. And they tend to grow to around 3 metres in height and make a really lovely rustling sound in the wind, so they seem like an obvious answer. And the clients were really happy with the storage under the deck. You can access this via a small door behind the water feature in the slatted timber that was designed to match the fencing. It's held on with magnets, so we didn't need any fancy latches or handles. Now, I'm not a fan of artificial grass, mainly from an ecological point of view, but I do believe it has its place in a roof garden, or in this case, where the small lawn is required, but yet is going to become, it's just never going to be successful under the trees and with the heavy use by the grandchildren. I did discuss gravel and potentially play bark, but in the end, this was the best choice for the space. Now, you'll probably notice that with a lot of these images in the gardens that we've recently completed, they don't tend to have any furniture within them.
And obviously it's quite common for a client to want to buy new furniture for their new garden, but I think it's really good if you can get in early while designing and talk about the furniture. The right pieces of furniture can really make or break a small garden, keeping things in scale and proportion with the space is absolutely vital.
Sometimes a built-in seat can really help, as it means you don't need so much room to pull the seats in or out when in a dining area. Other times, simply getting an outdoor sofa that's the right size, maybe one size down, can make all the difference.
So a quick recap, today we've talked about
use zoning to manage the client's brief at the very outset, manage the outlook onto a garden with its boundaries, consider using angles and curves rather than lines that might emphasise the boundaries, and think of clever dual uses of areas where possible, and embrace the size of the garden, show off what you can do with a budget.
There we go, that's it. Hope you found that useful and been able to give you some tips and techniques as to designing a small garden. If you have found it useful, please do give us a thumbs up, a bit of a like, and don't forget to subscribe. As I say, next topic we're going to be doing next week is going to be all about low maintenance gardening. This is probably an element within the wish list that I get. I'd say 80 to 90% of the gardens that I design, clients often want lower maintenance, shall we say. So don't forget, if you are already subscribed, you might want to turn the notification on just so that you know when that lands. But in the meantime, have a great week. See you all very soon, and thanks for watching.